The homicide desk involves a lot of domestic issues, so I figured that for today's film, we'd look at A Streetcar Named Desire, a classic story that takes a good, hard look at exactly that. The story about the story. The art of cinema has a few different parents, thanks to the way that motion pictures evolved out of static pictures. The first few movies were as much about showing off this strange new technology as they were about telling a story. And the fact that they didn't have synchronized audio or dialogue for the first 3 decades or so put some fairly hard limits on the kinds of stories the film could depict. Still, even before talkies came out, it was obvious that plays and stage acts were the closest media to films, and so began the long relationship between Hollywood and Broadway. Actors who made a big splash on Broadway were regularly recruited by the Hollywood studios, and Hollywood actors whose contracts expired would head to New York and exchange the national exposure of film for the looser standards of stage productions. However, there are some real differences between the acting skills needed by movies and by plays. You can't act naturally in a play. Your gestures have to be broad, your expressions need to be exaggerated, and even when you're whispering, you have to project so that everyone in the house can hear you. After all, you aren't communicating with a person standing next to you. You're communicating with an audience member who may be sitting 100 yards away. On top of that, a play is a live performance, so you have to get it right the first time, every time. Mistakes still happen, of course, and so you need to know how to improvise and roll with the punches. But on the other hand, you can't do anything too spontaneous, since you might throw the other actors off, and because performing in a play means doing the same thing between 3 to 8 times per week. Film acting rules are very different. With the cameras right there next to you, film actors can afford to be subtle in ways that a play actor simply can't. Even the makeup is less thick. Also, since the performance is recorded, actors can memorize lines, rehearse, and perform their scenes individually rather than all at once and in chronological order. They can experiment with different things and different takes and surprise the other actors in order to get candid reactions. Sets are handled differently too. Depending on the play, a set may be a single static apartment or other environment with a lot of details, or it may be a few movable set props, which suggest different environments. Even the set painting method usually involves broad strokes of splashing layers of paint on top of each other in order to create the illusion of texture at a distance. But if you use these techniques on a film set, it'll come out looking like someone covered the walls in grimy shit, especially in a black and white production. Because of all these differences and more, translating a play into a film isn't an exact process, although it is a lot easier than translating a book or a short story. A Streetcar Named Desire went through a few different changes in order to get onto the silver screen. In the first place, Streetcar the play has a single setting, the Kowalski home. And while that's fine for a stage play with limited real estate, the film adaptation has the chance to add and move scenes to take advantage of the fact that films can create more than one complete set. Many scenes had to be cut or shortened to turn a 3-hour play into a 2-hour movie, and a couple plot points had to be changed because of the Hays Code. But aside from all that, the 1951 film version of Streetcar is remarkably accurate to the play version. In fact, the movie borrows Marlon Brando, Carl Malden, and Kim Hunter from the original Broadway production and Vivien Leigh from the original London production. So let's see how these stage actors adapted to a new medium in the story. We begin with Blanche Dubois coming to New Orleans by train and getting directions to her sister's place, directions that include a streetcar literally named Desire. Apparently, New Orleans had an unusual naming convention for its public transportation back in the day. I should also point out that this short scene isn't the only reason for the film's name, and we'll be getting back to it later. When Blanche gets to her sister's place, she meets her sister's upstairs neighbor, Eunice, and finds out that her sister and her husband, Stella and Stanley Kowalski, are out bowling. Blanche goes to the bowling alley, and as soon as the sisters hug, the first words out of Blanche's mouth are complaints about the apartment. Stella offers to introduce her to Stanley, but Blanche complains about the glaring light and begs off. The sisters sit down in the alley's restaurant for a drink, and Blanche explains that she's taking a leave of absence from her teaching job for the sake of her nerves. She then guilt-trips Stella about leaving their family estate, Belle Reve, but Stella doesn't bite. Next, they return to the apartment, and while Blanche still doesn't like the place, she insists that it would be better for her to stay here than at a hotel. They then talk about how much Stella loves Stanley, and after that, Blanche gets incredibly passive-aggressive about how she lost Belle Reve after Stella abandoned her, and then the rest of their family died. Distressed by the news, Stella runs into the bathroom, leaving Blanche alone when Stanley shows up. They introduce themselves, and for reference, even when Marlon Brando was young and fit, he still sounded like he was talking around a mouthful of gravel. He was basically Sylvester Stallone before Sylvester Stallone. They make small talk for a while, and Stanley gives off the distinct impression that he is not impressed with Blanche's Southern Belle persona. He mentions that Stella told him Blanche was married once, and bringing this fact up seems to affect her deeply. She explains that her husband died young, but says nothing more. The next day, Stanley brings in Blanche's truck, and he hears about Belle Reve. He wants more information and paperwork, because apparently, under Louisiana law, a husband and a wife share their assets, and he's skeptical about Blanche's claim that she lost Belle Reve, especially when he sees all the fine gowns and jewelry in her trunk. Gowns and jewelry which, it turns out, aren't actually worth that much. In the process, Stanley manhandles all of Blanche's stuff, which deeply offends Stella. She leaves in a huff, and when Blanche comes out, she tries flattering Stanley again, and it doesn't go well. After Stanley insists some more, Blanche finally pulls out the papers that show the property was foreclosed. Apparently, the sisters' grandparents sold off their land to pay for their debaucheries, and then the rest was lost paying for all the funerals. In the process, Stanley manhandles some love letters, which deeply offends Blanche. As Stanley discusses having a lawyer friend of his take a look at the papers, he casually lets drop that Stella is pregnant. Blanche seems to have somewhat mixed feelings about this news. She also keeps calling Stanley a Polak, by the way, which is not a flattering term to describe someone of Polish descent. Later that evening, Stanley's card game is running long, and Eunice upstairs isn't happy about the noise. The sisters come back after a night on the town, and although Stella tries to tell Stanley to pack it in for the night, he stubbornly continues the game. At the same time, Blanche meets Harold Mitchell, a man who is noticeably more soft-spoken and sensitive than the rest of Stanley's friends. He also has a sick mother, and he's unmarried. Blanche turns on the radio, which really pisses off a drunken Stanley, but it also serves to draw Mitch into the back room, which was her goal. The two flirt for a while. Mitch puts a Chinese lantern over the bare light bulb, and when Blanche turns on the radio again, Stanley grabs it, yanks it out of the wall, and throws it through a closed window. This gets Stella angry, and she starts throwing Stanley's friends out the door, so Stanley grabs her and starts punching. For their part, Stanley's friends pull him off and knock him out, and once they revive him in the shower, they evade his wild punches and run out. When Stanley is finally alone and has a moment to think, he realizes what he's done and he starts screaming, "Hey, Stella!" Eunice, the upstairs neighbor, has taken Stella and Blanche in and refuses to let Stanley see them, but Stella goes down anyway. Stanley does look genuinely sorry for what he's done, but yeah, their relationship is pretty messed up. The next morning, Blanche comes down from the upstairs apartment and finds Stella in the afterglow of what was probably some crazy makeup sex. Blanche has no idea why her sister considers Stanley's behavior acceptable, but all Stella can say is that this is how Stanley always is, and she kind of enjoys it. Blanche compares Stanley to the streetcar named Desire, loud, crude, and entirely beneath the dignity of a Dubois. She actually seems more concerned about his low-class behavior than by the fact that he hit her sister. Some time passes, and as Stella and Stanley prepare to go out for the evening, Stanley asks Blanche about a hotel named the Flamingo in Oriole, which is where she lived until recently. Apparently, it's the sort of establishment where men go to find women of an easy persuasion. Blanche denies having ever gone in, but she's clearly nervous. She then talks with her sister about her reputation, her age, and the fact that she's dating Mitch now with the intention of marrying him. After Stella leaves, a young man shows up collecting for the Evening Star, a newspaper. Blanche flirts with him and asks for a kiss, apparently because he reminds her of her former husband. That same evening, she goes out with Mitch and they get to talking about her past. The boy she married was sort of the weak and sensitive type, and one day, when she yelled at him for being weak, he went out and shot himself. This is one of the bigger changes from the play, because in the play, Blanche caught the boy having a homosexual affair, which is, sad to say, a better reason to commit suicide in 1940s and 50s America. But, of course, according to the Hays Code, homosexuality doesn't exist. And so instead, he killed himself because he's a wit. For his part, Mitch doesn't seem to mind that she's still clearly hung up on her first love. He wants to settle down before his sick mother dies. She wants a husband who will get her out of her sister's hair. And so, it's not exactly true love, but they do care about each other. Following another time skip, Blanche has now been at the Kowalskis for 5 months, and Stanley has been using the time to check up on Blanche's history. Apparently, she had a lot of sexual relations back in Oriole when she lived in the Flamingo Hotel, and the real reason she left her teaching job is because she had sex with a 17-year-old student. Stella doesn't want to believe Stanley, and she gets especially upset when he says he also told Mitch about what he discovered. Although it's Blanche's birthday, Mitch doesn't show up for dinner, and when Stella complains about Stanley's manners, he smashes his plate and says he's sick of how she and her sister have been insulting him ever since Blanche showed up. He storms out, and when Stella goes out to get him, he says that everything will be better when the baby is born, when Blanche is gone. And for a birthday present, he gives Blanche a bus ticket back to Oriole, which basically means he's calling her bluff. Stella and Stanley start arguing again, but they're interrupted when her contractions begin. While they're at the hospital, Mitch shows up and demands to know the truth, switching on all the lights in the apartment in a very literal and symbolic move. He explains that he didn't trust what Stanley said, but he then checked for himself and found out Stanley was right. So, Blanche finally drops her breathy Southern belle accent and tells the truth. After her husband died, she went from one man to another, looking for comfort but never finding it. Mitch tells her that he doesn't mind that she's older than what she let on, but she lied to him, and she's kind of crazy, so he has no reason to marry her. I can't really say I blame him. He has no obligations to her. When Stanley gets back, he's in a good mood. Stella is still giving birth, but it'll be a while yet, and so he's going to get some sleep. Meanwhile, Blanche has fallen completely into her delusions. According to her, she'll soon be going thanks to a wealthy admirer who will take her along on his big Caribbean yacht. Also, according to her version of events, Mitch came crawling back to her, and she rejected him. Since Stanley's in such a good mood, he plays along at first, but when Blanche keeps going, he starts to press her on the details, and he gradually becomes more and more aggressive. Towards the end, Blanche realizes that she's in danger, but she's stopped at the door by what is probably a hallucination of an old woman selling flowers for the dead. When she tries to get out again, Stanley stops her and then rapes her. After another shorter time skip, we find out that Blanche has gone through a complete mental breakdown, and so the Kowalskis are having her committed. When the doctor comes to take her away, she says her famous line, "I have always depended upon the kindness of strangers." Meanwhile, Stella can't forgive Stanley for what he's done, and so she's gone upstairs to Eunice's again, and this time she'll never go back down. This is the other big change from the play, because in the play, Stella stays with Stanley because that's what happens in abusive relationships. The analysis. A Streetcar Named Desire is not the kind of movie you can really enjoy. It's not meant to entertain, and in fact, it can be very difficult to sit through. Nevertheless, Streetcar also happens to be the kind of movie that can really benefit those who manage to make it all the way to the end. Streetcar comes from a long series of plays which take a hard, critical look at the issues that hide beneath the veneer of domestic life. The first such play, at least according to my education, was A Doll's House, another single-set play written by the Norwegian Henrik Ibsen in 1879. The play is about Nora Helmer, the wife of Torvald, who secretly and illegally borrowed money some years past in order to pay for a trip to Italy, which was for the sake of Torvald's health. A lot of things happen, it's a long play, and in the process, Nora realizes that Torvald loves himself more than he loves her, and when he forgives her at the end, it's the same sort of forgiveness one gives to a child who doesn't know any better, and not to a fully grown woman who knows exactly what she did and why she did it. Furthermore, she realizes that neither she nor Torvald ever truly understood one another, and so she leaves her husband and her kids to go find out who she really is. As Ibsen himself would later say, A Doll's House isn't a feminist play, it's a humanist play. Because men as well as women can become so caught up in the roles society assigns to us that we forget who we are without our masks. We all need to be selfish when it comes to self-identity. Streetcar was written by Tennessee Williams, who also wrote similar plays like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and The Glass Menagerie. Williams had an advantage that comes from working in theater instead of film since, at least at that point in time, theater was getting much less attention from crusading censors. Williams could get away with more honesty in a play, such as that bit about homosexuality, because while there were still protests about supposedly obscene material, there was no production office which could stop a playhouse from putting on a specific show. Now, there were obscenity laws and state censorship boards which could and would shut down theater productions after the fact, but even as early as the 1930s, back when the Hays Office was still codifying its censorship rules, the censors were starting to back down from Broadway. It's kind of interesting how it seems to come and go in waves like that. And it's enough to make you wonder what the hell censorship is for when you can just switch mediums to find what you're looking for. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a movie in which Henry Fonda must save a boy's life in just 1.5 real-time hours, and all without leaving a single room.